In verse 5, Joshua said to the people, "Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." And Joshua spoke to the priests, saying, "Take up the ark of the covenant, pass over before the people." They took up the ark and went in front. And the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to magnify you in the sight of all Israel." Now, this is significant because what's about to happen is not only for Israel, it's something else. Because he says that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Now, the miracle with Moses was the crossing of the Red Sea. But what we see here is that Joshua, in obedience to what God says, is foretelling or prophesying another miracle. And he says in verse 10, this is chapter 3, verse 10, Joshua said, "Hereby you will know that the living God is with you, and that he without fail drive out before you all the inhabitants of the land. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord pass over before you into Jordan." Then there's the command to take the 12 stones. But in verse 14, it came to pass when the people removed from their tents to pass over Jordan, the priests bearing the ark in front, that as they were come to Jordan, and the feet of the priests, this is verse 15, were dipped in the brim of the water. And by the way, in parenthesis, because I know a lot of people are going to say, well, sometimes the Jordan dries up. Believe me, in biblical times, this river Jordan was much fuller than it is now, because this is why the Jordan was feeding into the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea was high. Now, everybody's taking the water out of the fresh water out of the Jordan, and the result is the Dead Sea is drying up. So in biblical times, the Jordan was bigger, and it actually says here that in parenthesis in verse 15, Jordan overflowed all its banks in the time of harvest. So it wasn't just a matter of coming to a small trickling river and crossing over. Here it's a flood tide. But verse 16, the waters which came down from above, that's further up, rose, stood up in a heap very far from the city, that is beside Zeratan, and those that came down towards the Sea of the Plain, the Salt Sea, failed and were cut off, and the people passed over against Jericho. And the priests that bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of Jordan, and all Israel passed over on dry ground until all the people were passed over. Then the priests came out. We know that two things happen, three things if you want. Firstly, what I'm seeing is that just as in the leadership of Moses, the biggest miracle was the crossing of the Red Sea, which not only opened the way to freedom, but as you know, the miracle of the Dead Sea is that it destroyed the Egyptian army. And I don't need to remind you, I'm sure you've heard me say this before, the Egyptian army was the most powerful army in the world at that time. And it destroyed not only the best of the army, but destroyed the chariots as well. And so the crossing of the Red Sea was a significant miracle. But now what we've got is we've got a very similar miracle in that the Jordan stands between Israel and the Promised Land, not just Jericho. Now, I've always looked on it in the sense that it was Jericho, that fortified city, that was the problem. But that was not the only problem. It was, how do you get this vast army? It's estimated there may be more than 2 million people at this time, with all their sheep, their cattle, their kids and everything, across this fast-flowing river. And so again, the same miracle occurs, that God, by a miracle, holds up the water so that they cross over on dry land. Now, two things happened. One, that the Israelites were commanded to take a man from every tribe, 12, that they were to pick up 12 stones, and they were to put them in the river, and as Joshua says, so that when your children in the future, your children and your grandchildren ask you what's meant by these 12 stones, you will say, it is a reminder that God is with us. He opened the waters of the sea. We crossed over on dry foot, and that God has promised to deliver the land into our hands. So those 12 stones were a powerful evidence to Israel. But I've already read to you what Rahab says. And it's very interesting. You move on to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites on the far side of Jordan, the Canaanites and so on, when they, which were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan in front of Israel until they were passed over. I mean, how long did this take? I mean, we're not talking about a handful of people crossing over in a matter of an hour. It must have taken, I would reckon, more than a day. All this number of people. I mean, you could almost think of a week. But the fact is that that miracle was so great that here in chapter 5, when the armies and the people on the far side saw and heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the river Jordan until they passed over, indicating some time, that their hearts melted, neither was there any spirit in them anymore because of the children of Israel. So in actual fact, the miracle of the crossing of Jordan was to be as significant to Israel and significant in the life of Joshua as the Red Sea had been in the life of Moses.